Hello, I'm Luo Haoxi from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Department of Cultural and Religious Studies. It's my pleasure to be here to present my article, Local or Global: Translating Chinese Parents into Growing Up for the West. So let's start with the background. In 2021, the Chinese game market continues to be the largest in the world, but the actual sales revenues growth declines. There are many reasons for the declines, but one that cannot be ignored is the suspension of game license insurance by the National Press and Publication Administration, which has made many new games cannot be released, and many small and medium game companies were cancelled because of this. With the development of the domestic game market being suppressed, more and more Chinese game makers are turning to overseas markets. We can see a high growth rate of the actual sale revenue of Chinese self-developed game in overseas market, and many Chinese mobile games have now been among the top games in the mobile game market in many countries, and that is why Chinese academics and officials have made the export of Chinese games, especially mobile games, a strategy to enhance the soft power of China. However, the commercial success is not directly equal to an increase in soft power. The International Game Award appreciates games that are more accomplished in terms of gameplay, narrative, and visual art, and Chinese games are regarded as less creative and rarely make it to the international award. This has led to the fact that even China has the biggest game market. The US and Japan are still considered as the leaders in games and game culture. So it is in this context that this paper focuses on a Chinese indie game, Chinese parents, and its authorized remake, Growing Up. The remaking of indie game is a rare phenomenon, and a Chinese indie game remade by a Western designers, challenging the stereotype of Chinese copycat. Through the comparison of these two games, this paper argues that Chinese parents express its realistic critique of China's parenting and education through the congruence between gameplay and the lived experience of Chinese players. While growing up with its internationalization ambition transforms the local and specific realistic expression into an imaginary universal myth of growing up and the American dream. And we will discover how the game mechanics affect the meaning of games and how Chineseness, Westernness, and Americanness are reconstructed in the process of translation. And first, it is worth noting that the relationship between the terms translation, localization, and globalization is ambiguous. Therefore, it is necessary to first explain these three terms. Localization refers to the translation or adaptation of a product made in one place to make it more marketable in the target region through a range of technical, linguistic, cultural, legal, and marketing process. And games as a cultural artifact and interactive media that can invoke emotions and produce meanings. So the localization of games need to consider how to retain an equivalent play experience for the target players, and therefore often require a combination of translation strategy, including foreignization, domestication, no translation, transcreations, etc. And globalization is generally discussed in the context of globalization. The globalization refers to the range of the process necessary to prepare and launch products worldwide based on the strengths of a world-aware product design. And internationalization is a process of designing a product so that it can be easily localized in order to achieve worldwide distribution and success. And while globalization is often used to describe the global expansion of Western products, recent research on Asian popular culture has found that the intersection of regional tendency and the global feature implies the globalization of local materials and context, which means the good local product can be re-exported to other regional markets. And translation. In everyday usage, it refers to the transfer of meaning from one language to another. But in translation studies, meaning does not precede translation. Rather, it is translation that actively produce meaning and borders. Therefore, in this paper, localization is understood as a specific translation actions and by emphasizing adaptation as a translation rather than an industrial action, the paper focused on the negotiation of the meaning of these two games. Chinese Parents is a life simulation game released on Steam on September 29, 2018, developed by Luo Yuan Game Studio and published by Coconut Island Games. The main designers are Liu Zhenghao and Yang Geyilang. So this is their first indie games, and this realistic game simulates the journey of a Chinese child from birth to at the age of 18, where the player has to explore the child's potential, organize the everyday schedule, and develop the skills, and also need to try to maintain the balance between parents' faith and the child's pressures. And the final goal of the game is to get a higher score in the final exam that can and then can start a next generation. When it was released, there was only Chinese language and voice storyline, but it soon became very popular and reported by mainstream media in China and abroad, including People's Daily, Southern China Morning Post, and the New York Times. People's Daily recommend everyone to play this game, and in China it's extremely rare for the official media to make such a positive comment and recommendation to a game. But sadly, since July 21, 2020, Chinese parents have been removed in mainland China for maintenance, while it is still available in the rest of the world. Released on October 14, 2021, Growing Up can be seen as a faithful adaptation of Chinese Parents, produced by Polish developer Vio Morak and published worldwide without mainland China by Coconut Island Games. Growing Up challenges the setting from China to the West. They both focus on growing up in the 1990s, starting with babies and ending at the age of 18 and replacing the college entrance exam with the SAT exam. Some of the Chinese minigames were removed, such as the class officer competition and the red packet battle. They have an all-star production team with experienced designers, so the artworks, music, and the dialogues are well improved. We can see the comparison of artwork in this slide. But compared to the sales and the popularity of Chinese Parents, Growing Up with a better production team and the adaptation for Western players is not as successful as Chinese Parents. However, Growing Up is not a bad game. It received a very positive in Steam. But when I collect all the reviews through Pensum, I found that the top 10 reviews that are voted as most helpful are bad reviews. So these bad reviews are mainly critical about the game mechanics and settings, but many of the settings and mechanics are actually from the Chinese parents. So the following part is a discussion of why the elements that worked in the Chinese parents failed to work in growing up. These are the comments. In audiovisual translation studies, there are Many studies that take TV format productions and film remakes as translations and discuss how different versions of audiovisual products deal with cultural differences and imaginations. So how about games? In fact, game localization is not a simply linguistic translation exercise, but it is a conscious and active mediation of transnational circulation of image, stories, and games, and a further mediation of consumers' imagination of the possibility of social life. The adaptation of growing up is answering the question, what is Chineseness, what is Westernness, and what is Americanness? The name of the game has changed from Chinese Parents to Growing Up, which suggests that it is not about parenting in a particular region, but about growing up that everyone in the world has experienced. In the process of cross-cultural translation, we once again fight the problem of universalism and particularism, as pointed out by Naoki Sakai. So the West represents the omnipresent and invisible universality of the modern world, while the Western, while the non-Western, for example, the Chinese experience must be understood in their own context. In fact, even within the West, there are differences, and there are always places that are more Western than others. So in our case, the most Western place is the US. The game also has a Chinese name, 美国式家长, American parents. This proves the link between the game and the Chinese parents on the one hand, but on the other hand, more importantly, it shows that the Western style of growing up in this game is in fact an American style. Through this re-translation, the non-regional is re-regionalized, and the universalism is revealed as particularism. As Mendenberg said, no game is global in and of itself. Rather, it is a local thing that can be made global through practice of localization, or shown to be local by letting the text remain. For example, the fifth dual in Chinese parents has been removed, which makes it culturally particular to China, and once again reinforce the cultural stereotype imagination that only Chinese people are keen on face saving. And there are so many differences between the SAT and the higher entrance exam in Gaokao in China, but they keep the final exam as the only determinant university administration and future career occupations. It is a choice, and that makes the SAT in this game not American nor global, but it is a hybrid of Chineseness, Westernness, and Americanness. The gameplay of Chinese Parents was inspired by the Princess Maker, but unlike Princess Maker where players know that they are a father or a mother, in Chinese Parents, players' identity is ambiguous. They are both children and parents. Most of the time, player controls the children to do activities, but during the face duel, player controls the parents who use the 特长 trait of the child to beat other NPC parents. In order to win, players need to control and manage their children's life like a real Chinese parent. And it is this ambiguity that gave both children and parents the opportunity to experience the other side in games. As a review said, maybe we will one day become the people we hate the most. But in growing up, as the description said, this is the story of your life. They want players to only identify with the child. The first duel is removed and the parents become a functional NPC who only give nonsense requests and useless reward. This has led to a lot of criticism from players, and it also takes away the realism of understanding between parents and the child in China. Another important change is the removal of the inheritance mechanics from Chinese parents. In Chinese parents, when players start a new game plus after one generation, they will gain an inheritable buff from the next generation's career. And you can see, for example, the artist career will provide so many buffs for the next generations. So some achievements and careers are really difficult to achieve without these buffs. So basically, you cannot get a full grade in the first generation, but after many generations of accumulations, the children were born to be a genius and can easily go to a good university without learning anything. So this is a critical parody of social class inequality in China. In growing up, this inheritance system is removed, regardless of the parents' occupation or family background. Every generation, children grew up from the same starting line, and the difficulty becomes lower, allowing players to get the best SAT score in the first generation. There is no class inequality. In fact, there is no class. In comparison to the realism of Chinese parents, this is a real myth of a meritocracy that eliminates class differences. And in fact, this is the American dream. The next part is about gender issue. So Chinese parents are homophobic. There is no homosexual option in the game, as both boys and girls can only develop romantic relationship with the opposite sex. Heterosexual marriage is compulsory. Even if you don't fall in love with an NPC, you will be forced to marry a random unnamed person at the end of each generation and have a child. Growing up in another side is LGBT friendly. Players can choose their character's gender as well as the gender of the parents at the beginning, and the different NPCs has their own sexuality, which makes them more like a real person. Players can also choose between homosexuality and heterosexuality in this game. So the question is LGBTQ friendly global or universal? For the supporters, the answer is yes. But for the opponents, it's not. It is regional to them. There is one player said that, "Luckily I held my ground and didn't come out of the closet. As a Chinese player, I just can't accept the American political correctness." So this suggests that after an international adaptation, constructing a gender concept as universal or global, the players in a particular region may regionalize it again. So this is the conclusion. This study finds that the localization of video games is a process of meaning production and bordering, in which game mechanics, in addition to language, images, and audio, are also involved in this process. Therefore, if game mechanics is understood as natural and universal, it is easy to reinforce global and local frictions in the cross-cultural translation of video games, especially when dealing with hyperlocal indie games such as in Chinese parents. And if we take players' agency and specificity into account, we find it impossible to maintain and transfer the equivalent meaning or experience. I don't mean to criticize the Western cultural hegemony in growing up. Rather, I think it is through translation that the tensions in the ongoing negotiation between cultures, power, experience, affect, identity, imaginations in cultural artifacts are exposed. So this is part of my references, and thank you for your listening.